Good morning, everybody, and thank you very much for joining us for this special webinar on the launch of the Mayhew review. We will be discussing today with all of you the final report from the Mayhew review, which was published a couple of weeks ago, looking into the scale of change needed in housing and care options for older people in this country. It's a report that already has secured lots of interest in the media. It's a report that's been mentioned in the House of Lords chamber, that's attracted questions in Parliament. It's already had a big impact, and I'm sure that that will continue in the weeks and months ahead. I just want to start by saying thank you to Professor Les Mayhew of the International Longevity Centre and Bayes Business School, Professor of Statistics, who has conducted this review over the last year, drawing on new statistical analysis and expert input from over 40 organisations and individuals. He's done a great job, and I'm sure you'll agree the final report really should all make us stand up and take note about what needs to be done for housing and care for older people. In today's webinar, we are delighted to have a stellar cast of speakers, including Professor Les Mayhew himself, who will be starting the ball rolling with a presentation on the report's key findings and also recommendations for national and local government. Coming in with the planning angle, we'll then have Ian Warner from Clothing. And then on the social care perspective, we will have Sarah Livideas from Social Care Works. Delighted to have them both with us. And then we'll be hearing as well from Michael Voges, Chief Executive at ARCO, on what this all means for the integrated retirement community sector. Do remember to take up your opportunity to submit questions in the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, and then in the final part of this webinar we will have opportunities to hear your different questions. Let us know as well who you are and where you're submitting the question from, so we can include that later on. But without further ado, I'll hand over now to Professor Les Mayhew to take us through the key findings from his final report. Over to you, Les.
Good morning, everybody. I think I might have been muted there momentarily. Thanks very much to ARCO for inviting me to do this review. And it's been an incredible journey. I've met lots of people and have had lots of interesting discussions, and these discussions are continuing. So let me just set out for the next 10 or so minutes the main findings and arguments for what I conclude. So first off, warnings of the impending social care crisis have been spelt out in many parliamentary and government documents and policies down the decades, but they're yet to translate into shifts in either housing policy or the delivery of care to older people. In this review, I spell out what needs to happen and why, and my arguments also speak to connected areas of policy, whether the wider housing crisis, the shortage of affordable homes, house price inflation, stagnating incomes, or the generational consequences of young people and families not able to get on the housing ladder. I argue that care needs to become more preventative, more people-centred, and to be delivered more efficiently. Unusually for reviews like this, it doesn't ask for lots of government money. There's lots of private investors lining up to oblige. The only recommendation that will cast is putting stamp duty on the same basis for last-time buyers as for first-time buyers, but I don't think it will be expensive. History shows that something like this needs a big push from central government, as well as an alignment of policies in three sectors: health and social care, housing policy, and in planning. The main requirement is for government to get its ducks in a row, to recognise what is going on in this sector and to set up interdepartmental machinery headed up by a minister or ministers to make sure it happens. A key breakthrough would be to get them to recognise that building more retirement homes should be on a par with building homes for first-time buyers and to change its policies accordingly. Planning obstacles especially came in for a lot of stick in both our survey and the industry roundtable, which we undertook as part of this review. On a really positive note, there are lots of win-wins in my findings, whether it's helping people to live in appropriate and better accommodation, easing the housing crisis by freeing up oversized homes, improving the health of older people so that they use the NHS less, more efficient delivery of social care and improving access to care, repurposing failing town centres, providing access to financial advice for people contemplating downsizing or right-sizing, levelling up disparities in retirement housing across the country, and also with a climate theme, improving the thermal efficiency and climate proofing of old stock on change of ownership. A final one, which is you might not have considered, but is important, and that's relieving pressure on the green belt, because that's one of the implications of my recommendations, although I don't mention it explicitly in the report. I back up my findings with an analysis of what the future could look like, both if you do nothing, but also if you build on a much bigger scale. The executive summary is available, but I really do commend you reading the full report, which I think is an easy read, but has lots of insights and new data that I can't really expose in this short presentation. The central plank of what I say in the report is that we need to build more retirement homes, obviously, 50,000 a year to be precise, on top of what I call business as usual, which only provides about 7,000 or 8,000 homes a year. We also need to make more efficient use of our housing stock, but also sweep away some of the obstacles which create inertia, and I'll come to this later. Doing this would ease both the care and the housing crisis. The report spells out the details, so let me start with a few background statistical remarks. Next slide, please. My first slide is about trends in living arrangements. It shows changes in population, households, and household size linked back to a base of 1980, when I start the clock, so to speak. The top line in this chart shows the number of households. The line below it shows the population growth, and the line that's declining below the horizontal axis is average occupancy of people's living arrangements. So what's happening is this: by 2040, the UK population will have grown another 10% to over 72 million. More significant is that 1 in 4 of us will be aged 65 plus. Demographers sometimes call this a super aging society. But what's really interesting here is every area of the country will have significant proportion of people in that age range. Currently, that's not the case. Secondly, households are shrinking in size year on year. And this is important. If people lived in homes more suited to their needs, 50,000 fewer homes would be needed to be built annually. Put another way, almost as many bedrooms are being decommissioned through under-occupation as are being replenished. There are around 180,000 new 65 plus households added to the stock each year, but only around 7,000 homes, retirement homes, are being built. Surveys show that many people want to downsize, but they can't due to a shortage in supply. And meanwhile, there are something like 22 million surplus bedrooms, 12 million in the 65 plus bracket alone. As a result of all this, the housing market has been defying gravity for some time as prices continue to increase, although they're going through a downturn presently. And that market, the housing market, is basically being eked out by longer mortgage contracts, low interest rates, and government help to buy schemes. Now, obviously, all that could change at any time, and it has already with the hike in mortgage rates. So what does that mean? It could mean that it takes 10 years or more for a first-time buyer to save for a deposit, and by the time they've saved that amount of money, the goalposts have shifted. Each generation finds it harder than the last, whether you look at generation X, Y, or Z. So this chart divides them into, next chart, please, slide, please. I'm sorry, next slide, please. Thank you. This chart divides the population into categories according to living arrangements and care needs. And there's a basic division between age less than under 65 and age 65 plus. Now, of course, 65 is an arbitrary demarcation, but it doesn't change any of the arguments that follow. A majority of older people live in standard or mainstream housing. A relatively few live in communal settings like residential care. By 2040, we expect there to be nearly 12 million older households, 3.5 million more than that today. Of these, we expect 6.2 million to live alone, and this includes 1.9 million in the critical 85 plus age range. That's up nearly 1 million on today's number. Assuming business as usual, as the number of living in care homes will increase to around 650,000 and the number receiving domiciliary care to well over 1 million. There will also be comparable increases in staffing levels in both sectors, and informal carers providing 20 hours a week or more will approach nearly 3 million. All of this leads us to the uncomfortable conclusion that the social care system will flounder because there are not enough workers to deliver care to a widely dispersed older population. The vast majority of older people will live in standard housing, piling pressure on geographically dispersed care services. In this review, I was open to very different retirement models, but I was already convinced of the importance of timely access to care. A decade ago, I evaluated a service for a local authority which saved between 14 and 28 bed days a year and 5 visits to A&E in this particular vulnerable group, and it was all done through better care coordination and sharing of information. It was based on a combination of timely home visits, preventative measures, and help around the home with basic repairs and help with basic tasks. Wider research also shows that people with timely access to care make fewer visits to GPs, they get more quickly discharged from hospital back to where they live, where care was waiting for them, and it also delayed transfers into nursing and residential care. It also has some life extending benefits as well. My study with colleagues at Whiteley Village in 2017 of every resident that ever lived there in the previous 100 years showed that residents lived longer than the general population, as much as 5 years longer. And there are many other examples. Next slide, please. Of course, it helps if clients live in decent accommodation in which services can be set up and delivered more efficiently. In other words, the economics of care delivery is very important. The Levelling Up white paper, for example, says for older people trapped in non-decent or unsuitable accommodation, the government will work to increase the choices available to them. My third slide focuses on integrated retirement communities. These combine independent living with access to care and various amenities, but it's all in one place. The dotted insight to the right shows how integrated retirement living would fit into the wider care community. In this arrangement, there might be, if it grew into a very large size, there could be some displacement of care as well as reinforcement. For example, a displacement of people that would have been in residential care into integrated retirement communities, and people that would have been in other retirement housing into retirement communities as well. Crucially, in this model, there's access to care on site 24/7, should it be needed. So how does it work? Well, briefly, care is coordinated by a care manager with administrative support. This requires a certain minimum size needed to cover the costs. A minimum of 60 to 100 units, providing a decent average based on the feedback that I received. Some care costs are factored into the service charges, such as basic cleaning and tidying, but other care costs are on top. I calculated that in a community with roughly a mature community, let's call it, with 150 65 plus residents, you'd expect something like 34 full-time equivalent carers, one for every 4.4 residents, averaging 9 hours per week. But that's a variable calculation depending on the age and health of the people in the particular setting. In a domiciliary setting, the support ratios would need to be much higher because of the time spent traveling between care clients' homes. I found in my analysis there are around 630 integrated developments, villages, estates, etc., which meet the criteria of being more than 60 units of accommodation in size and had the required numbers of amenities and care provision. Although smaller developments than 60 have residential or nursing care facilities, larger developments were 3 times more likely to have these than not, based on CQC status rather. Next slide, please. In this slide, I look at some of my modeling scenarios of what would happen in different circumstances. So based on business as usual, only about 7,000 new units are being built each year, but not necessarily in large-scale developments, but also isolated units. In the grand scheme of things, based on my housing and general housing analysis, this could not even be classed as a flea bite. Business as usual would not alter the balance between living in standard housing and nursing and residential care, which would also grow. After talking to lots of people and the round table that I mentioned previously, I concluded that we were all underestimating the potential. At the same time, it was clear from surveys that more older people wanted to downsize, but were put off by the lack of choice. So I therefore developed these 3 scenarios, building 10,000 new units a year, 30,000 and 50,000 on top of business as usual. Let's take the example of the 50,000 per year case, which I think would start to make an impression on the sector. If 50,000 new homes equates to 25% of all new housing starts, which are currently around 200,000 a year, although, as you know, the government has a target of 300,000. And whilst this would directly benefit older people, the houses released would result in various displacements. One of these is that housing would be vacated for young families to move into. These could be new families who would in turn vacate properties that could be used by first-time buyers. So a big increase in start homes there too. There will be gradual falls in the numbers living in standard housing and residential care as a result of this proposal. The proportion of older people living in standard housing, for example, would fall to 81% from 87% under business as usual by 2040. Now, the number of property units indicated under the scenarios does not translate directly into the number of integrated developments. For example, if the average size per development was 100 units, we'd be looking at 500 developments a year under scenario C. But it would be more realistic to expect a spread of sizes depending on site availability. For example, about 80% of existing developments are in urban fringes. And one of the things I propose in the report is that we should be exploiting some of the gaps left in failing or declining town centres. Next slide, please. With so many advantages, you might say, why hasn't this happened already? The report lists 5 reasons. One is inertia, another is lack of choice, and another is the lack of help or advice. Final one is planning obstacles. Broadly speaking, people have enough wealth, but supply is also an issue. They are discouraged by the limited choice available and by the cost. Surveys also show that they're put off by the high levels of stamp duty. Wealth is an issue in some cases, obviously, but it's not the main problem. Of the 8 million older households, 75% own their own homes, and only 26% are social or private rented, which I think needs to be addressed in a different way. Of the almost 1 million property purchases a year in England, only 10% involve purchasers aged 65 plus, even though they account for 28% of all households. Even so, we note this is still far in excess of the number of retirement homes being built, suggesting and confirming there is significant unmet demand. Institutionally, there seem to be biases in the planning system. There's evidence of some local authorities being anti-retirement and with many applications going to appeals and so on. Developers complain that they're being put in a different category to nursing and residential care, which means that they face extra costs. Related to the inertia issue are complications of financial decision-making in later life. People can be confused about which option would suit them best based on their circumstance, health, and other considerations, whether to buy, whether to rent, whether to lease, or shared ownership. All of these have different financial trajectories and may suit some people more than others. For this reason, the review also looks at the pros and cons of different types of tenancy, but I accept there's a lot more work to be done in this area, including making advice more available. So that's the main takeaway in this particular case, the need for independent advice to help people with decision making, unless they're blessed with a good financial brain and foresight. Next slide, please. So in this brief overview, I can't squeeze in all my arguments behind the recommendations, but I'll briefly list them here, again, in the hope that you'll read the full report. First, there should be an accelerated programme of retirement housing construction with up to 50,000 units a year. My preference would be in communities of 100 units or more, so some 500 plus would be built each year. Now, I realise that that's a big challenge, but I think it's best to start big rather than tiny. I would also include repurposing sites in town centres as part of regeneration, something that also came out strongly in the survey and discussions. Planning departments must also put retirement housing on a level playing field with residential and nursing care, so that the cost profiles, investment profiles are not unduly distorted. Next slide, please. So this is my final slide. Again, reiterating the point about the individual consumer, this process needs to be made easier and cheaper to move, so that the homes that they move into are as good as, if not better, than the ones they are vacating in terms of their acceptability given their age and other circumstances. Two particular recommendations, as I mentioned, are better access to advice, financial advice, but also nil banded stamp duty on the same basis as for first-time buyers, which I think is now £425,000. So in conclusion, I try to show that the UK is failing to adapt to the far-reaching changes in society caused primarily by an ageing population, with the consequences that whilst we have enough homes in the country, the distribution of those homes is not working very well at all. Fundamental change is needed in the way we provide care to older people and their housing options. So thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Les. That was excellent. And I think everyone will agree that between current provision and what Les says there that we need to achieve in terms of those 50,000 new homes for older people every year is absolutely stark, and great also to have those recommendations on a practical level for what the government needs to do to get us there. A sort of mini manifesto almost right there in front of us to achieve the change that's necessary. One of the key barriers that Les just identified there was planning, and we are now delighted to be able to turn to Ian Warner from look at that perspective in particular, what this report means for the planning system, and what could actually change about it as well to enable us to get to the kind of figures that Les is talking about here. So over to you, Ian.
Thanks, Sam. I welcome the Mayhew report, which is one of the latest reports addressing the situation that we're in for housing. The report once again picks up on the option of considering a revision to the use class orders to better address the issue of IRCs. However, from my own experience, I think the matter of use class definition alone doesn't really go to the heart of the problems with delivering schemes in planning. At present, you could probably say the two main issues can be summarised as sill impacts and the viability, all too often associated with the request for affordable housing. A different use class isn't necessarily going to change this. On the matter of sill alone, one only has to take note of the recently published RTPI practice note on housing for older people released the other day to recognise perhaps some confusion. In their report, they've stated sill or use class is an important consideration as use class C2 doesn't incur sill contributions while C3 does. That's perhaps an oversimplification given that there's a number of local authorities, Waverley being one of them, who have specific rates to charge sill for retirement housing, and they only differ depending on whether or not you do or don't provide affordable housing. It therefore kind of means that just changing a use class definition isn't going to address sill, which ultimately affects the viability on the schemes. And coming to viability, you can never escape the matter of affordable housing for retirement schemes. And I know ARCO themselves are doing work at the moment to try and better address the whole matter of viability and what is a reasonable expectation of affordable housing, knowing that you can't really compete against the mainstream house builders in terms of their overall level. The second key issue I think this report really picks up on is the matter of need. We've all known for some time we've got an ageing population with the over 65s growing much faster than the general population. This report perhaps sets out the first time a clear picture of how that growth can be manifested, given the 50,000 units per year that it's suggesting under its the third approach as such. And this perhaps is the first time we've really seen a number referenced, given that the PBG itself specifically states that there is a critical need for provision of housing for older people. It's perhaps now time that the government finally grapples with this maybe through the task force, but specifically with more meat on the bones in any revised MPPF to require councils to really tackle head on the matter of how we deliver retirement housing through local plans, perhaps setting out minimum levels of need and policy directions. This obviously reflects work done by Irwin Mitchell in their update report this year, which has reviewed LPAs in terms of their policy arguments. It's great these reports are published, and we as a sector, whether that's developers, promoters, agents and anything else, are all interested in it. But perhaps my key take on this one is we need decision makers at local government to also actually pick up on these reports, because without them understanding the issues, we're still going to struggle. And the final topic I'd kind of pick up is the matter of choice. I think it's exactly right that Professor Mayhew's report picks up on the benefits of being able to regenerate urban sites, town centre location, and everything else. But I think we also need to bear in mind as well, there is still a role for the rural kind of settings, because it shouldn't be one size fits all, one type fits all kind of approach. Using rural locations means we can make best use of alternative methods for delivery as well. So I just kind of think that's a key thing to deal with. And I think I'd finally kind of sign off on a planning frame to coin a phrase that a colleague of mine uses relating to affordable housing. Is effectively saying we need to stop talking about numbers, and we need to be referring it really about real people in real need of appropriate housing as they age. And until we change that metric, I think we're still going to kind of struggle when we're just looking at numbers. So I think that's a brief planning really review of kind of the report and really our future challenges moving forward.
Thank you very much, Ian, and very much highlighting as well, though, in terms of planning, how this has both a national and local element to it, and touching on things like the NPPF, but also what the relation with that is, and local councils needing to do more as well. I just wanted to mention that please, everyone in the audience, feel free to share your reflections throughout this webinar and also afterwards on Twitter and LinkedIn. And you can use the hashtag Mayhew Review as well to share your thoughts. But this report and this question is equally about social care as it is about housing and planning, which is why we're delighted to have Sarah Liverdares from Social Care works with us to offer a perspective on what these findings mean for the social care sector. So over to you, Sarah.
Thank you very much, Sam. Good morning, everybody. Really good to see you, even though I technically can't see you, but I know you're there. So good to see you. And so I'd just like to start by saying that to have such an authoritative and heavyweight statement on the benefits of older people's housing and the housing with care, integrated retirement communities in particular, is really welcome. I've worked in adult social care all my adult life, and I've always championed the policy of promoting independence and preventing deterioration, which those of you that are as old as me and has worked in the sector for as long as I have will remember that it really started in the 90s. And we know, generally speaking, that what is good for the individual is good for the state. So providing really good joined up support at home where people want to be has good outcomes for them, and they've been well rehearsed. So I'm not gonna name them again now, but it also saves money for the public purse. So it's good for the individual and it's good for the NHS, it's good for local authorities. Now, one of the reasons that integrated retirement communities effectively save money for the public purse is that a lot of the people that live in them are paying for their own care, and they're paying for their own care through money that they've perhaps released through the sale of their former home. So this brings me on to social care reform and the impact of the lifetime cap on care costs. Now, at the moment, we don't know what's going to happen with social care reform. The mood music is it's going to be kicked down the road again and perhaps never implemented. But right now, we need to behave as though it's going to happen. And what it means is that where somebody who's paying for their own care, if they want that money that they're paying to count towards the cap on their lifetime costs, they're going to have an assessment from the local authority under the Care Act. And local authorities have already said they don't have enough staff to do these assessments. So it's going to bring private payers, people that were quite happily, getting on with life, paying for their own care, into the orbit of local authorities. And they're probably going to go onto a waiting list, waiting for an assessment. There's no guarantee that when they have that assessment, the local authority will deem them to be eligible for care. So they might not even start the clock ticking on their care costs. And we know, even Dilnot himself said that many people will never actually reach the cap because you have to be paying £86,000 just on the care, not on any other costs, in order to reach that lifetime cap. So only 20% of private payers are ever even going to benefit. So I see that as a threat to the well-being of people living in integrated retirement communities. And let's see what happens perhaps later on today with regard to social care reform. The other place where people are paying for their own care, largely, or perhaps 50% of them, are care homes. And Professor Mayhew has made some comments on what might happen to the number of care home places that are needed as more older people's housing is hopefully built. I think the picture is very complex with care homes. The first thing to say is a lot of operators are still experiencing under-occupancy post-pandemic. So where people died, not necessarily from COVID, but where people just passed away in the normal way, they've not been replaced. So people have not moved into care homes in the same numbers that they were before. And then the other thing that's happening is that care homes are not able to accept new people, including people coming out of hospital, because they're so short-staffed. So that is affecting and will affect financial sustainability of care homes. The other thing about care homes is that many of them are not fit for purpose because the buildings are so old. they don't have 100% ensuite, or where they do have ensuite, it's not a proper wet room, which makes infection control very difficult, if not impossible, and impacts on people's dignity. But what I would say is that until there's a cure for dementia, the number of people that need intensive support at the end of life is going to continue to increase. We know the numbers, we know the demographics, the numbers will continue to increase. So we will need some kind of support for people at end of life. And I think the question needs to be not so much, will we need fewer care homes, but what are care homes for and how can we improve them? And in my opinion, there's going to be a place for both, a need for both integrated retirement communities and care homes, perhaps sometimes in combination. So that was what I had to say. Thank you, Sam.
Thank you very much, Sarah. And extremely interesting to think about it in those terms, in terms of what it means for the social care system as a whole, and the relationship between IRCs and care homes, and the points you touched on at the start as well around saving money for the public purse. I think now more than ever, when we're facing these financial and economic challenges, those kind of arguments hopefully will hit home strongly. I'm now going to hand over to Michael Voges, the Chief Executive of ARCO. What does this mean for the integrated retirement community sector, Michael, and how kind of monumental is the challenge that Les has presented us with today?
Thanks, Sam, and thank you very much to Les for writing this report. And I think it's for us, there's, I think, several conclusions to be drawn. One is around, one of the things that the stark things about it is just the sheer numbers that are in the report. One of the figures that I found most worrying almost is that at some point we're going to have 1.9 million people over the age of 85 living on their own, which if you think about that figure alone is a huge challenge from a social point of view, from a social care point of view, but also about mental health, loneliness, and other things in this country. I think what we will need to do is shift the understanding of what this sector does. I think the task force, as we've discussed, needs to come together and actually bring different policy areas together. I listened into a planning meeting last night, which luckily ended in a consent for one of our members. But you did have one of the council members saying, "Oh, if this scheme is going to be lived in by a number of 80-year-olds, I don't think they're going to go out much. They're just going to sit around and be passive recipients of support services," which was fairly insulting, I thought. I would say that I would probably agree with Sarah that I think the IRC sector is very much an extension of the care home sector. It's not a direct replacement of the care home sector as it is now, but it's probably a direct replacement of part of the residential care sector that we had 30, 40 years ago, when you imagine that many people in care homes even didn't actually have substantive care needs at all, and that really has crept up over the last few years. Care homes do a tremendous job at the end of life and in complex dementia care cases, and I think they will probably continue. But that trend that we've seen from care homes going up the acuity scale and IRCs effectively replacing those settings where people lived with a bit of support and a safety net, that's something we see in every country that we look at. So that's something you have in Germany, in France, the US, and pretty much the rest of the world. What I would also say is that the biggest competitor, though, for our sector isn't actually care homes. It's people staying in their own home and not making that move to an IRC, which might be better for them, better for social care budgets, NHS budgets, and whatnot. But I think the issue there is that one of the challenges that we've had is, how do you persuade people to come when actually the choice of staying at home was a fairly easy one for people who could leverage in the services that they may need into their family home. As Sarah has said, I think the workforce challenges in social care are very substantial, and we might talk a bit more about that, but we might be short 500,000 care workers by 2035. That's what Skills for Care projects, which basically means that the main competitor for our sector, which is older people staying where they are, might be a less viable proposition in the future. And if you talk to home care providers now up and down the country, there are already areas that even if you want to pay 28, 30 pounds an hour for private domiciliary care, it will be very difficult to find people to actually deliver those services because there simply aren't enough people to do that. So I would imagine the trend towards co-location, putting people or like enabling people to make the choice to live in one place where care can be delivered effectively, efficiently, and in a preventative manner that you reduce the quantum of care. That's something that will have to continue in the context of us running out of care workers. And that is a political discussion which will be difficult for the current government, because one of the issues that we need to address is that the government's, this and previous governments' mantras has always been that we want people to remain in their own home. And effectively what we're seeing is that option will not be available in the way it was in the past. And finally, one reflection I'd have is if we did get to 30 or 50,000 a year, and one of the questions in the Q&A actually addresses this, I think it's not a question of just doing 50,000 more of the same, because I think we've already seen the housing sector for older people change substantially over the years. I think the sheltered housing model of the 1970s and 80s has not proven to be sustainable in the long run. We already have issues whereby even the private sheltered housing model has shown that the house builder perspective, resales, asset management are not sufficient to make this a sustainable alternative. So I think we do need to think about, if we are going to build 30, 40, 50,000 a year, that we will have to keep innovating and building more of the models that we know work, rather than just saying anything for older people is fine, let's just kind of get these boxes built and then forget about them, because the long-term sustainability of this sector is going to be key. And again, that's really what other countries have been doing already. And I keep saying that the fact that the UK has a large sector which is for sheltered housing effectively with low levels of services, and a home building sector where it's about building houses and selling them traditionally, is an international aberration, and we don't see that anywhere else in any part of the world. So I think that's really around big challenge. It will need to be new models. It will be IRC models, it will be long-term operational models for sale, for rent. But yeah, it will be, it really does need the task force to pull that together. But those are my comments, but I'm sure other things will come up in the Q&A.
Thank you very much, Michael. And if I could just ask all other speakers to put their cameras back on to have this Q&A discussion now. And Michael made a key point there around how we might call the task force the Older People's Housing Task Force quite broadly, but within that, it's crucial, isn't it, to distinguish between different types of older people's housing and their benefits and what we need more of at the moment. Something Michael also touched on there was those workforce challenges that we see within social care at the moment. I just wanted to start with a question to Sarah about that. And Skills for Care report, for example, tells extremely stark findings about how many more social care staff we're going to need to find if we carry on as we are by 2035. What do you see as the current scale of the challenge there, Sarah, and what needs to be done?
Yeah, so undoubtedly there is a big challenge around workforce. A lot of it is post-pandemic. So we know that the demographic of people working in social care is largely an older female workforce. A lot of people left due to pandemic burnout, compulsory vaccination. Ironically, a lot of these women, some of these women will have left to look after older relatives who actually can't get access to social care. And of course, we've got the impact of Brexit and migration policies as well, which are not helping. What's happening is that especially combined with the cost of living crisis, wages are more and more important in terms of people are just basically looking for decent pay and prospects rather than the other benefits that they might have valued in the past. And they will move around. They're moving around quite a lot. So average pay for care workers now in the private sector is around about £12–14 an hour, which compares with the £9.60 minimum living wage, which of course might change with the budget. But what I think is going to happen is there's going to be an increasing disparity between local authority funded services and private services. I think I've got a couple more things to say. People that work in care are largely motivated by really wanting to make a difference to the people that they support. And if they're left short-staffed, what happens is they become really frustrated because they're just doing task-based care and they can't give the time to the people that they support in the way that they came into that work in the first place. And so they will get frustrated and leave. So you've got like a kind of ever decreasing circle. So what I would say is, as well as pay, you really, really need to think about your good recruitment and retention policies. And I just want to tell you a little anecdote, because everybody say, yeah, I know recruitment and retention is really important, you know, but do you really know what's happening on the ground in your service? And my little anecdote is that I'm currently working as a cook in a care home, because I went there out of interest as much as anything. And I've been there for 4 weeks, and it's bloody hard work, I can tell you. But in that time that I've been there, my boss, so the catering is contracted out, and I'm sure many of you that are operating integrated retirement communities will have contracted out your catering perhaps. And he's always telling me, I'm really short-staffed, and I can't cover the shifts, and have you got any friends that you could recruit, and can you do any more shifts? In the 4 weeks that I've been working there, I have met him once for 5 minutes, where he mainly told me how busy he was, and he was sorry he didn't have time to talk to me. He hasn't provided me with the training that I asked for on food hygiene, which he promised he would give me. You know, it's an online course, 15 quid, which he promised me when he recruited me. And he has never once said, you're doing a good job, thank you. So what I would say is that it's all very well as all pulling our hair out saying, you know, what we're going to do about this. But I would say, find out what's actually happening in your service. Are you really, really looking after your team?
Thank you very much, Sarah. I'm now going to turn to some of the questions we've had in the chat. So thank you very much, everyone, for firing those in. And the flip to the planning side of it, this might be one for Ian, but others may want to come in as well. We had a question from Roland at DLP about the basis behind the 50,000 a year figure. And he says that in planning appeals, inspectors are dismissing higher levels of need by taking a view that these are coming just from the professional side of things. These are professional views about how many more older people's houses are needed, rather than based on evidence around what older people are choosing, or, you know, the kind of demand coming from older people themselves. Does that tally up with your perspective? And do you think we need to focus as well on the kind of showing the demands from older people?
It kind of does. I mean, it won't be surprised. Kind of, I know Roland very well, and I mean, it won't surprise that one of the schemes that Roland's actually kind of dealt with, put for appeal. You have an inspector that basically says there is no choice, and if there's no choice, kind of where's the demand trying to come from? Because if you haven't got a product, you can't demand something. So the problem here is, and this is why I'm saying that the disconnect is, we kind of need to really stop talking about on an individual basis for every single scheme what is the need. Effectively, we all know there is a massive kind of need. What we really kind of should be looking at is actually flipping that kind of discussion on need, and really looking and sort of saying, unless of course an authority has got an over provision because it's already provided 20, 30 schemes in its authority and they're all in the same location, what's wrong with building another development? Ultimately, no operator is going to, given the complexities of building a scheme, the sales amount of, like, the sales rate and everything else, the income that's put in terms of finance generated, you're not going to build a scheme if you haven't already done your market research to demonstrate there is a need in that particular area. So why are we having to argue on every single application what the level of need is? It's kind of, everyone knows it, but no one wants to admit it, really. So kind of, I would love to say we'll stop talking about need, but we kind of won't. We just need, if this report gets taken up, as I was saying, by local authorities and everything else, the debate will be had long before we're making planning. And that's where I'd love to be.
Did you want to come in on that as well, Michael?
Yeah, I think there's I think this is a very good question in terms of this level of need does need to translate into local plans and other things, and the need demand question is an interesting one. But I suppose, and I'm not a planner, the way I would also phrase it is that the government just needs to realise that we do need to build many more of these. I think that's what Les was showing, because otherwise, you know, we have a massive problem in the UK. And the one thing that I think is we probably need to talk more about is that one of the issues why we need to transform the planning journey is that planning risk simply is too high for this sector. That the issue of going in for planning and, you know, building anything in the UK is difficult. There's massing issues, highway issues and whatnot. But the fact that you're going in here and you don't know whether you're going to get a consent, how you're going to get a consent, whether you need to appeal, and this whole question of will my affordable housing contribution be 0 or 5 million or 10 million or whatever, means planning risk for this sector is exceptionally high, and probably higher than pretty much any other use class that I'm aware of, short of maybe nuclear power stations. And that actually means that the cost of capital being deployed in this sector is still too speculative. And I think we need to reduce that planning risk and the certainty that we come to this sector with. That's what Build to Rent did. Build to Rent basically said, look, you know, we want more certainty what we need to do, and then we can actually get cheaper money and long-term money. And that's what we need to achieve. And I think the question of need and demand is a good one. What we need first and foremost is for government and local government to understand we need more of these. We need it to make it much more predictable, much simpler to build this, because that's when different capital will be deployed. That's when cheaper schemes will effectively emerge, because it will filter down into lower cost for consumers. Lower cost for consumers means higher demand, and then there's a virtuous circle that comes from that.
And this planning discussion links to a number of other of the questions that people have submitted as well. And Snez at Symphony Park was asking about what the task force in particular, when it hopefully launches soon, will be doing to change the planning system to support the kind of growth that Les has talked about being needed. On the planning side, Les, you said it was one of the main barriers at the moment. It's one of the key recommendations that you mentioned as well at the end of your presentation. When the task force does get going, do you have a view on, you know, when it comes to planning, what are the first things it should be looking at?
Well, I do think there are some steps to go through here, because I used to be a civil servant. I worked in the Treasury, I worked in the Department of Health, and I worked in work and pensions as well. And departments don't actually work very well together at a civil servant level. They tend to keep everything to themselves and say, oh, that's not my problem, that's Blogs's problem over the road in such and such a department. And it's still the case that the Treasury tries to, and Cabinet Office to some extent, try to pull these things together and develop a strategic view, and they pull together different groupings. But you know, you can argue about their effectiveness over time. But I think a really important transformative thing would be to get Treasury to say, yep, we've got a big problem. This problem's not going to go away. We need to, you know, our housing target of whatever it is, 200,000, 300,000 affordable homes a year is actually misplaced. It should be housing of all types and should specifically cater for this burgeoning need, call it need or demand, because I think the two things are connected in the aging population. I think once you do that, and then I think the basis for departments to work together and to look at things like integrated care, social care workforce, and all these other things we've been talking about. I think it makes for a better climate. The specific point about planning being high on the list is that I think once you take that first step, then the next step is what you need to do to make that happen. And it will soon become evident that the planning issues are one of the major barriers. And I think that this task force needs to come down heavily on the planning side to make it happen. One of the things that we haven't discussed is this disparity in or the levelling up issue. There are very few of these developments in Scotland, Ireland, Northern Ireland, or Wales, and they're also quite, you know, their distribution is also quite biased within the UK geographically. And I, despite what Ian says, I think there is a case for more rural greenfield sites, but that tends to uproot people from their communities and move them into unfamiliar areas. I'm slightly more in favour of developing these places in situ, so that people retain their links with their communities, with their relatives, and with their friends. And in my area where I live, it's interesting that, you know, there are at least 3 retirement developments, which are really high quality and quite impressive. Anyway, I'll shut up now. I think it's a sort of layered approach that we need here to make it happen rather than the bottom-up approach.
Yeah, Sarah, did you want to come in?
I want to make a comment about location, which I agree. Developing in communities is a bit of a no-brainer, but I just want to really make the point about the contribution that older people make, that people are aging make to society. It's not just, they're not just recipients of support and care, they make a contribution. So they go out in the street and they shop, they go out to restaurants, they grandparent, they volunteer, you know, they're quite fun to talk to, you know, so it's like, they make a contribution to society. So we need to enable them to continue to participate as citizens as well. It's not just about where the location is and can we get care workers there and can we get planning. It's about how do we enable people to carry on being part of society for the benefits that we get from them.
Sarah, in my area, the older people will even go around picking up litter and things like that and keeping the place looking very tidy. They do an amazing job, actually, when I think of all the things they do voluntarily and the you know, all the events they set up and hold is an incredibly vibrant.
Can you get them cooking in our local care home, please? Because that's what's really needed. I bet loads of them
Desperately
have got
needed.
skills.
Desperately
Yeah,
needed.
well, maybe I'll put that message out to our
Seriously,
church.
yeah, why not?
We've touched on quite a bit of the nitty-gritty of planning and kind of how exactly in that planning system we get more of these. I just wanted to finish as we've only got a few minutes left with a bit more of a broad question, which a number of different people have asked a question like this in the Q&A, including Joanne Cordell, Nick Hickman, around perception of later living that older people have. How because there's that challenge of people being attached to their long-standing family home, which is quite emotional often, as people have pointed out. How do we make housing for older people, specifically integrated retirement communities, something that older people really want to move into? And what's that question of the perception of these settings that they're moving into? So if anyone wants to come in on that kind of broader question, and any final remarks you might have as well, Ian.
I think a lot of it's about the terminology and making people aware of what these schemes are, because all too often, and local planning authorities are kind of one of the key components on this one as well. All too often, you talk about doing a retirement scheme, and automatically, a lot of local authority planners and everything else assume retirement equals care home. And if that is still the message that we've still got, which effectively is when you're old and you're in need of some support and care, but you can still live independently, your options are a care home. That automatically puts a lot of people off the idea of, I don't want to move into an institution. So I kind of think it's getting the message out there that actually there is a third choice, because for too long the options were care homes or sheltered housing. Neither of those kind of cover the middle ground, which really IRCs cover, which is where you're older, you could benefit from some support, but you still maintain your independence and you want to live in a community. So I kind of think, and I know that's kind of how we got the term IRCs, because I know kind of ARCO have done a lot of that work on effectively what is the best brand name to actually define, because you had extra care, closed care, assisted living, enhanced sheltered kind of housing, everything else, and that became the problem. So I think as long as we can get the message out there that there's a positive choice, and actually that's the key thing, it's making it a positive choice of, don't leave it to the last minute to end up moving to a retirement scheme because now your care requirements are there, because by that time it's too late. So the whole benefit of these schemes is getting in early, getting settled and everything else, when actually you don't need that care and support that you otherwise might do.
Yeah, something that old people want to move into for sure. As we only have a few minutes left, if I can ask speakers to be brief in their kind of in their response to that question and any other concluding remarks. If I go to Michael next.
Why don't you go to Les and Sarah first, and then I'll kind of I'll try and.
Sure. Les, did you want to come in?
Well, there's so many points there. I think Ian's right. We need to get people to think about moving earlier in life and not, you know, triggered by an event such as the death of a partner or something else. I think that another point that was made is that these retirement communities should be vibrant places and not be stuffed full of people who have, very, very serious end of life issues. I do think one of the problems I encountered in this, what do we mean by integrated care community? Should they have high acuity facilities in addition to other facilities, so that you can keep what Austrians, for example, call step-up facilities within a single development? I think so. That's a question of vertical integration, it seems to me, and using economic language. How far up the scale do you go? But I also think there's a case for what you might call downward integration, which is residential care actually going down the age range and being incorporating younger people as well. Otherwise, there can be, as everybody said, a danger of sort of silting up with particular demographics in these communities, and you need to keep them sort of moving and vibrant and happy places for people to live and thrive. So I'll stop at that point.
Thank you, Les. Sarah?
So I'm just going to be very practical in my response to this. So, there's for those of you that are operating integrated retirement communities, one of the things that I'm sure you're already doing is hosting events and activities. So get your local community in, get people going out, get them coming in, so people actually know what's there and can see it for themselves. But the other thing that I would say is it's not just about marketing, it's about PR and your use of social media, for example. I mean, if I hear another chief exec say, I don't use social media, I'm going to scream. Like, why not? Like, what are you doing? And what are your people doing? What are your employees doing? What are your team members doing? Your middle managers, your cooks. I tweeted a picture of a cheese board, which I'd made, which I was quite proud of. So if anybody wants to follow me on Twitter, you'll see it there. I've had 305 interactions with this cheese, including people saying, quite a lot of people actually saying, my mother was in a care home and it's brought a tear to my eye to see that you actually care. Now, we've got a huge opportunity with social media for all of us to be promoting and really giving people a glimpse inside of what's actually going on. And I would encourage all of your employees and you yourselves to use, whether it's Instagram, Facebook, TikTok, Twitter, LinkedIn, whatever, get the message out there.
Yeah, we haven't quite advanced enough for TikTok yet, Arco. We need to think about that.
Let's work it out. Let's figure it out.
I saw the cheese on LinkedIn yesterday.
If children can do it, we can. There must be a way.
Michael, any final comments on cheese or otherwise?
Nothing on cheese, I'm afraid, but generally speaking, I think I agree with Ian about the perception of this, and I think that really is the one of the key bits for us. And probably two reflections. One is around, I think we need to be mindful that we get the aspiration, we balance that out with the care and support available. And I think sometimes we have the problem that people see these schemes as only for older people and over medicalized, and then they don't want to go. Although I would say, and I do always say, that 50% of a group of 75-year-olds today will live to 90. So, we are looking at an extraordinary lengthening of life expectancy in the UK. And once you've reached 75, 50% chance that you can live another 15 years. So even if you're 78, it's a long stretch that you still have in front of you. Let's make that the best stretch that people have. On the other hand, I think the other problem we have is that sometimes these schemes are seen from planners as the opposite, as effectively just about lifestyles and rich older people drinking gin and tonics. And they fail to see the contribution it can make to the social care debate. So we need to kind of get that balance between, is it just about aspiration or just about care? It needs to be right. It needs to be a kind of balanced thing. And the final point there I'd say is that the best thing that you could really do is, I would very much advocate taking people around to these schemes, because older people are very much, or including stakeholders, if you take them to a good scheme, the vast majority of people say, I did not expect it to be like this. I thought it was going to be a care home and miserable and whatnot. So a compulsory visit for every 75-year-old to visit a retirement community would be fantastic. And just a final thing I heard the other day is that in New Zealand, the marketing budget of retirement villages, mature retirement villages often don't have a marketing budget anymore because it's all done on word of mouth. I think that's the thing that we need to get to, that, you know, obviously you will have to pump prime that a bit, but they are so successful because people know what it is. And at some point, you literally don't need to market it anymore because everyone just wants to be there because they've got that aspirational split right. And if we can get to that point where there's waiting lists and whatnot, and we have members that have that already, that literally they just, if there's a flat that comes up for resale, they go down a list, and often you don't need to go much past the fourth or fifth person on the list. That's really a situation we need to create in many more societies around the country. And I think, yeah, big challenge, but I'm sure we'll get there.
It's just worth saying statistically, in 50% of 75-year-olds are still in good health as well. So I think that's quite important.
And a good reminder as well from Michael that other countries are, perhaps some other countries are more advanced in terms of this sector, and there are things we can learn in terms of how they're doing it and how they've got there as well going forward. But just wanted to conclude by saying thank you to Professor Mayhew, firstly for his great report and also for his presentation today. Thank you to Sarah, Ian and Michael for a really stimulating discussion which covered both the planning, the social care, how we get more older people to become interested in this sector. So thank you for all the points that you made. Thank you to everyone who's joined the webinar today. It's been great to have you and to have your contributions on the chat and your great questions. The conversation definitely doesn't stop here and continues on social media. So, you know, follow Sarah's advice and get on Twitter and LinkedIn after this webinar. Share your contributions, your thoughts on what's been discussed today, and we'll be looking out for those as well afterwards. Take care, have a great rest of the day, and we'll see you really soon.